Hello, hello, you two.
Hey,
How are you doing today?
fantastic.
Well, perfect. Welcome and welcome back to anyone at home to get right on in. My name is Andrew, for those of you who do not know, and today I am joined by the wonderful JP Harker, who is the author of the Caledon series, as well as the hilarious Erica from Geeklet Reads Stuff. This will be the second installment in my little Readers versus Writers series that I am just getting started here on this channel. I will go ahead and link the first episode down in the description box for anyone who wants to see the full introduction or that conversation. The verses part of this whole title isn't as intense as it sounds, but today we will be talking about battle scenes. In general, though, this whole idea is just meant to be a place for readers and writers to come together and discuss certain topics in healthy, productive, and fun ways. So, with that now all out of the way, let's just get right on into some introductions, starting with Miss Erica.
Hey guys, my name's Erica, and my channel is called Geeklet Reads Stuff, where I primarily cover adult fantasy and a lot of adult sci-fi, maybe a little bit more adult sci-fi than most other channels. I kind of do the basic booktube thing, just getting it all started, and I'm super excited for this because I love a good battle scene.
Don't forget about your middle grade Mondays, though, because you definitely have that little section for the kids.
Oh, I do. I do a little segment called Middle Grade Monday. It's for one of my nieces, where I just like read some middle grade books, kind of looking for things for her, and I just like to talk about them. And it's super fun. There's so many great middle grade books out there.
There are. I'm discovering from your videos. And Mr. James, JP, tell us a few things about yourself, my friend.
Hello, I'm James, aka JP Harker. I'm an indie author from Wales, Cymru am byth, for those who are watching. I have written the Caledon Saga. I've written some other fantasy books, but Caledon Saga is the only one that's out at the moment. Um, I'm an obsessive martial artist. I paint war games figures because I'm cool. And in 5 months' time, I'll be a parent, and I'm terrified.
Oh, but that's so
Also,
exciting.
I write battle scenes.
You write good battle scenes, so I'm very excited for this
Excellent.
conversation with you. I didn't know that you
Allegedly.
do martial arts, though.
Oh, yes, I'm a slut for it. I've trained in more or less everything.
Wow. I just started some YouTube jujitsu, so
Nice, nice.
Brazilian or traditional?
Brazilian, because I've been doing yoga, so I felt like I
So
was ready for
scrapping on
the
the ground
more.
with Gracies.
What was that?
Scrapping with the Gracies, the Brazilian stuff.
Yes. Well, let's go ahead and
It's
jump on in. Oh,
for them as you know. No, I was just gonna. It's Gracie Jiu-Jitsu is the other name for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but that's just martial arts pedantry. Sorry.
hey, but now I know that. I didn't know that before.
That's from the Gracies who founded it, the ones in the old UFC.
Oh,
Hmm.
wow. You're already teaching us interesting things, JP.
All I
Do
know,
not
I learned
start
from the
me on that
Karate Kid.
subject. Go on.
So then, JP, since you are a martial artist then, and since you do write some epic battle scenes, maybe you can start off by telling us how what you know in person then translates into your work.
Okay, well, I've been training martial arts my whole adult life. So my whole adult life has been about 18 years now since I started university, and I've been training in traditional jiu-jitsu and various weapons things and karate, taekwondo, kickboxing, and a few other things, because it's fun to get beaten up. And it helps a lot when you're writing action scenes, when you know how it feels to hit and be hit, and you know how it feels to swing weapons at people and have them swung at you. And it gives you a good perspective on it. It gives you an understanding and an empathy with people when you've been hit a lot. You know. One of my pet peeves in fight scenes is if a guy gets kicked in the balls, he's out. He's not. He's just angry. and I speak from bitter experience as both giver and receiver of this. But there we go. But yeah, it gives you a better understanding if you've done lots of fighting yourself.
That's super interesting. I like that just because, I mean, in a general sense, when they tell you to like write what you know, I write myself. We don't really know too much about each other because we've just met, but I don't know what it's like to be hit. I've never been in a fight in my life, which is weird.
Really?
I'm 6.5 feet tall, and I've been this tall my whole life. So when I was younger, I always felt like people were just like scared of me, I guess, in that sense. But I also just don't want to fight, except for I want to learn proper ways of fighting. But I have no idea what it's like to swing a weapon at somebody, so it's harder to.
Oh, it's great.
That. I'm sure
It's
there
awesome.
are definitely times when I would like to.
Well, that pretty much covers my first question I had for you really well, because I was wondering, how do you prepare for your fight scenes? It sounds like you know a lot about like hand to hand, but how about with weaponry? Do you do like some research about it, or just sort of go with your gut?
A bit of both, because I do also train in weaponry. It's mainly Japanese stuff that I've trained in, swords and staffs and knives and chains and things like that. But in the last few years, I've given a go at some European stuff, which has been interesting and a little bit different. And so when I'm writing about fighting in a shield wall, I fought in a shield wall. And when I'm talking about blocking and parrying and getting hit and rolling away, it's because I've done it. And I haven't, done it trying to kill people, because this is being recorded and I can't record that I've killed people. But
I don't want to admit that.
Yeah, but the training does help, and it gives you a visceral appreciation for it. As far as preparation on a larger scale goes, I'm an immense geek, as it's probably well recorded, and as well as playing board games and strategy games, I'm also an archaeology graduate, and I've been studying Roman history for a very long time and medieval history for a very long time. So yes, it's just putting my largely useless in the real world knowledge to some use.
Well, it's great because it takes from so many different areas. And do you find that you just, whenever you're writing those scenes, you just take a little bit from maybe your knowledge of the Romans, a little bit from Japanese, and just kind of mash it all together?
Oddly, on the larger scale, it tends to be Roman and medieval stuff, because that's my better understanding of strategy and tactics. And on the up close and personal, especially when it's one-to-one fighting like dueling, it tends to be slightly more Japanese than would really work for Celtic people, because that's the sort of hand-to-hand combat that I'm used to. I've done only a very little bit of kickboxing and things. Most of it's been Japanese stuff. Sorry, I keep adjusting my headphones because they don't quite.
That's super cool. Would you say then that if you're reading another book, right now I'm just going to throw out Joe Abercrombie because he, in my opinion, has some really great battle scenes. But would you be able to read a book like that and be able to tell that the author might not physically have been through battle scenes and tell that it's more research based as opposed to personal experience?
I don't want to name names because that's a mean thing to do, but I have read several books where the battle doesn't make sense. It's not consistent, it's not logical, and I appreciate you're writing a battle to forward a story. I totally get that. But it still has to make sense. There still has to be consistency, there still has to be logic. And if that's not there, and it's clear that they didn't really understand what they were on about, that kind of gets to me. And it's even worse with hand-to-hand combat. When I see some of the books where people write about the way people fight, and I think, no, they don't. That would not happen. My other pet peeve is big means slow. No, it darned well doesn't. I have been outfasted by some very big fellas in my time, and I've been bigger than people and been faster than them. And it's a huge pet peeve that big guys will be slow. They're not.
That's one thing I've noticed in what, as a reader, I'm reading. fights in real life tend to be really fast. They're over and done in 30 some seconds. How do you as an author translate that fast battle into words?
It's difficult because you want to sort of milk the scene for its emotion, so you want to drag out your individual combat the way they would on film. Whereas we all know, well, there's a slight side note, in Iaido, which is traditional Japanese fencing before Kendo came along, movements are about 5 seconds long, and that's it, because that's how long the fight would last.
Wow.
And that's reflecting the realism of it. So on the one hand, yes, you want to reflect that realism, but what I try to have is I'll find some excuse for the fight to break off, or some excuse for them to have to be separated, to give me that time to put in the emotional reaction and the concepts of what's going on in someone's head, and then start the fight going again. Because you can't keep exchanging blow for blow and standing up and thinking you're going to last, because you're not.
Right.
It's a rather long-winded answer, sorry.
Well, no, that's fantastic. Because whenever you're talking about like the blow for blow, it's almost like you have to coordinate the movements, almost like a dance.
Yes. Very rarely will you cleanly strike another person's sword if you're in a medieval sword and shield sort of combat. That's not what it's there for. You're not there to parry things away. You're there to hack at people, and the shield is there to defend. So fighting blow for blow doesn't really work. And so there's a lot of clumsiness. There's a lot of closing the distance and stabbing or shoving or backing off and swinging to take your breath and things like that. So it's messy, and you want to do cool stuff and cool moves in there, but you do need to make it a bit messy when it gets up close.
For your scenes, do you prefer to have that closer perspective, like that we're just watching one character through their eyes, or having like an outside perspective watching the battle?
Always character POV. That's how I've always done it. I'll happily do, because I'll break up my chapters with like the asterisk mark, and I'll happily do different character POVs and have sort of half a chapter from one person's eyes and half a chapter from another person's eyes further up the field. But in my humble opinion, the godlike looking at it from above, that's for textbooks, that's for research. It's not something that's entertaining to read, unless you're a geek like me who likes reading about battles. But what you want to see isn't, these are the tactics of the battle. That's secondary. What you want to see is, how does your character feel about the battle they're in? And you get that by being inside their head.
I love that whenever I'm reading a battle scene, when it is from the perspective of the character, because you just feel so much more, I don't know, I guess just involved in the fight that's going on, and you really feel the effects of it and everything else.
I remember seeing something about when they were filming the Bourne films, and they were very keen on having the camera in the car, because they said the more we have in the car, the more the audience feels like they're being hit when there's an impact, or that they're jumping over the obstacle. If you have it from outside, it might look like a cleaner shot because you're seeing the car fly over something, but the audience doesn't care. Whereas the audience does care if they're in the car. And it's the same thing with battles.
That's super interesting.
Totally makes
Humble
sense,
opinion.
though.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. And this is like a random thing, but the other night I was stargazing with a friend, and we had a very similar-esque conversation about how when you're outside and looking at the stars, it feels so like three-dimensional and real and scary, but like you could just simply sit in your car and like look out the window at the same stars, but then it has a whole different effect because you have like the car around like in your peripherals, and then you feel like you're just inside. And she was talking about how it looked like a observatory from the car, but then outside it felt so real. And so just hearing what you said about those Bourne films made me think about just like that idea of the perception and how easily it can be altered by the smallest little thing.
It's a single sheet of glass, but it makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so with some character-driven battle scenes, I think that the three of us here would all agree that character-driven over plot-driven for battle scenes in a general sense. At least that's kind of how I feel. But Erica, tell me some things that you respond to most when you're reading battle scenes. And if it is character-driven, what about the attachment to the characters keeps you reading through the scene?
I think when I look back at fight scenes that I really still carry with me, it's the scenes that had a long build up beforehand. Like you knew this conflict was going to happen. Think like in Ender's Game, whenever Ender fights with Bozu, that fight builds up basically throughout the whole book. And then when the fight scene does happen, I think it's chapter 12. I looked it up earlier. It's quick. It's like that. But it's so impactful just because there's been so much build up and the slow tension filling throughout the book. And also, you mentioned Joe Abercrombie earlier. In The Heroes, I think he did a really cool thing with his fight scenes. When the battle was going on, you would have these two characters, whoever kind of survived their conflict, you would follow them into another scene with another character. And it just almost whipped its way through the scene, going from character to character to character. But it gave it such a great just flow of action that you felt the movement throughout.
It's interesting that I don't know. I know you know that that particular book was not my favorite of the
Yeah,
Abercrombie books,
sorry.
and I struggled with that book because I felt like that book was more plot driven than character. But that's just neither here nor there, I suppose. But how about for you, JP? What about when you're writing or when you're reading? What about the character attracts you the most into the fight scene?
This is going to make me sound mildly psychotic, but what I like is how sort of the dreadful impact it has on people when terrible things happen to them or happen to those around them. And the way I tend to do mine, I like the idea of the way it went character to character as the scene went character to character. The way I tend to do it is I'll tend to cut off just as something horrific has happened to whoever's head we're in, and then cut back to them with a man that nearly destroyed my mind and soul, and do it that way because, and this is going to sound mildly preachy, violence is a terrible, terrible thing. Uh, I've been training my whole adult life. I love books on warfare. I love military history, but violence is an awful, awful, dreadful thing and should never be engaged in. And so when writing battle scenes, trying to get that concept across at the same time as you're trying to get across a certain idea of nobility and heroism, it's tricky, but that's what I like to do. I like to have horrible, emotionally impactful moments and mix it in with let's have a little of that romanticized nobility of warfare, but let's not forget it's a terrible thing that's happening. I feel like
Absolutely.
I've dropped the mood like many, many levels with that. Sorry.
Well, no, it's fight scenes should carry that impact and moving forward for the reader. I do think it's important that fight scenes have a purpose. Too many books kind of just pepper them in there as a way to get really from dialogue scene to dialogue scene. And they're ultimately inconsequential to the narrative itself.
The fight scene should always do something to color how the character is viewing the world or viewing themselves. And yes, I do get that they're put in to cause some excitement for the reader and to break up the dialogue scenes, as you say. But as you also say, it's pointless unless it has some kind of impact, either on, oh no, the world's a worse place, or oh no, I'm a worse person or a better person, or what have you. And that's why they should be there. But they should also be accurate and planned and very carefully executed.
Yeah.
Whenever you're constructing a battle scene in your mind and you're kind of putting it on paper, do you find yourself like really trying to describe what your other senses would feel like, you know, your sense of smell, taste, things like that when you're constructing the scene?
I use smell occasionally, normally for when people have been horribly maimed, but I think sound is the other big one that you want to use because of the confusion that that causes and the disorientation that that causes. It's a Richard Sharp line for the nerdy people who like the Sharp books, which is you don't see a battle, you hear it.
Mm.
And yes, you've described things visually because that's our primary medium, but put in a lot of sound as well because it helps you get in the car, so to speak.
Yeah. I can see how sound would be probably the most important of the senses in a battle. Like as you said, even more so than seeing, because the sound adds all of that chaos to it and that just sense of immediacy. And as you said, the confusion and just everything that's going on. But
You would be surprised sometimes in a real, just like a fight, two on, or, you know, one on one, it gets really quiet to the point where if you're not there, you're not entirely sure if something's happening. So I do think adding the sound effects into the narrative can really bring people in.
Oddly, and this is a slight tangent, sorry, uh, when speaking of sort of one-on-one fighting, which is a very different animal, I've often found it odd, and I think it may just be me, I don't know. I find
Yeah.
it odd when people cheer on in things like boxing matches and tournaments, because every time I've been in a match or every time I've been fighting or sparring somebody, I can't hear what's going on around me. If it's
Hmm.
one-on-one, I'm thinking of that guy. And it's only when there's a tiny break, if I've managed to catch hold of him and hold on to him, then I can acknowledge what's going on around me, which is what I should be doing. But when it's on and it's one-on-one, rest of the world is just gone.
It's
But that's
probably just that adrenaline dump and you kind of lose your periphery senses.
well, your eyes are on him and
Yep.
you're having it, son. But that is a different beast to battles. I do appreciate that.
I like a good one-on-one scene every now and then in a book. Because it is. It's a completely different feel to it.
it's a
Yes.
totally different feel. So, Erica, what about some things that you don't really like when you're reading in battle scenes, especially if we move toward like a plot-driven battle scene over a character-driven? What is something that makes you just tune out quick?
I've found with battle scenes, I'll either get really engrossed in them or I'll just pass them by. And I think sometimes it's when too much details put in. And I think sometimes authors may really want to kind of plan out every action. But if you put all of that detail on the page as a reader, it's hard for me to follow it sometimes. I think I like when I'm allowed a little more agency to imagine what's happening instead of having it like spoon fed to me.
What about you, JP?
Oddly, I do like detail. Just you've got to be careful, as you say, not to use too much of it. And I think one way around that is make the detail relevant to the emotion of the characters. So a detail of, it's vital that we cleave to the river and it's vital that the formation not be outflanked on the left and stuff like that. Yeah, put it in if you want, but it's not particularly going to engage your reader. But things like this particular piece of ground must be held, and it's because there's women and children sheltering there, or we must maintain this shield wall formation because there are weak men in this line and the strong have to look after them, and so we need to maintain unity. You can get your detail in, you've just got to do it in a clever way. You've got to make it done in a way that still appeals to what the reader wants to see, and what the reader wants to see is character.
I like that because it gives the reader a reason to care about these details kind of being followed.
I've been lucky that a couple of people have reviewed my books and said they have no interest in military strategy, but were still engaged in what was happening. And hopefully that's because what was happening was said in a way that was still relevant to what they wanted. It was, like I said, I'm a huge history geek. I'll write about shield walls and columns against squares and cavalry maneuvers all day. But as long as what is being done is felt at some kind of emotional level, you can get away with it.
I agree.
Hopefully you can get away with it. That's the key.
Do you tend to use magic in your battle scenes?
In the current series, there is magic, but it's very mild because it's a soft magic system, and you shouldn't use soft magic as something vital to a plot. I keep it as something slightly ephemeral. So we have things like druids will bless weapons, and warriors have what is basically supercharged chi, but we're calling it something else. And sorcerers and druids are able to give or take away courage. So we don't have much in the way of, well, we don't have much in the way of sort of throwing fireballs or things like that, but slightly subtler things like they can call down mist that will make it harder for somebody to be seen, and they can inspire or they can terrify. And I'll put that into the battle, but it's always playing second fiddle to the battle itself, because I like the idea that your vanilla human is the one who makes the real decision as to whether this is won or lost, and magic is just there to help or hinder. It's not there to decide the matter.
Awesome. Because that's what I was kind of wondering is how do you effectively put magic in a battle scene? And it sounds like, for you, you just kind of make it the outlier, not the important part of the battle.
Yeah. I mean, I did love reading Jim Butcher's Codex Alera. I don't know if you've read that, but that was a wonderful example of a hard magic system being used in warfare. And because it was very easy to understand, again, my pet peeve with things like battles, I have many pet peeves, I'm sorry. One of my pet peeves with battles is that if it doesn't make sense, if there isn't consistency, if there isn't logic, because if the reader reads it and thinks, well, that doesn't make sense, they're no longer invested in the battle. They're busy saying this doesn't make sense. So if you're going to do that, I love the way Jim Butcher made us understand the magic system so well that we weren't shocked or confused when that magic system was used in the battle. It's like, oh, of course, he's a watercrafter. Of course he's doing this. Of course he's an earthcrafter, so they're just using a version of that. With something like mine, where the magic is kept deliberately quite mysterious, you can't go using it to solve problems because it's just a cop-out if you use a soft magic system to solve a major problem. So in my case, maybe it's a cop-out, maybe it isn't. I have my druids and sorcerers giving people additional strength, giving people additional courage, making them afraid, making them brave. But the center of it is still the people involved. It's still the warriors on the ground and the soldiers who are involved.
For sure. I would also, I mean, in agreement with what you were saying, if the magic system is set up well beforehand and that it's not just used as a way to get things out, then I think that, hard or soft, it definitely works either way. But I feel like it's more about how the magic system is developed before the battle happens, to where like if all of a sudden now they have all of these powers that they can just do, then that's when it, to me, feels like a little bit of a cop-out. But also, side note, thanks, because my next topic is going to be magic systems, so I'm really glad that we're foreshadowing that now.
In transition.
That'll be a fun next one to have.
Yeah, do like a newscaster and just turn to another camera and then just start out on that. I think
that might end up being what happens with this series. Who knows? You have a thought, Erica. I see it on your mouth.
My dog's kind of bugging me a little bit.
We love. Mine moved. I was trying to keep her in the shot, but She does not like that camera. Doesn't even matter if it's a webcam.
Well, I guess my last question that I have here is, whenever you're writing your fight scenes, do you tend to use like a different sentence structure than you do through the rest of the book? Do you use like shorter sentences, maybe different ways to describe things?
I do tend to tighten up my sentences, especially when we're actually in the combat itself. If we're looking at sort of the wider battle, then it'll just be a slightly less flowery version of the language that's been used for the rest of it. Once things have gotten up close, there's a lot less in the way of commas, there's a lot more in the way of full stops. It's a lot of, sure, this happened, then that happened, then this happened, then that happened, and then this happened, and then he was horribly maimed, or whichever happens. But I think apart from just tightening things to give the impression of speed and a lot less descriptive language, there's not much of a difference, at least from the way I do it.
That was a good question.
Well, I think it's just...
wasn't a particularly good answer, but it was a good question. I'll give you that.
It was a great answer.
I just noticed that if I'm reading a fight scene, I really do prefer those shorter, almost choppy sentences like this, done, done, because it makes it so much easier to follow along and to know my place and where the characters kind of are in relation to everything else that's going on. Because if I do have one pet peeve with battle scenes, it's losing that perspective and not knowing where the characters are anymore.
Well, hopefully, what will have already been done, the scene will have been set with the longer sentences and the descriptive language before the action has kicked in. So hopefully the language of the setup has been good enough that the picture of the wider picture is there in your head. And so by the time we've gotten to the action, we don't need long sentences anymore, and we can just get sort of the blow by blow stuff. And once that's done, you can go back and pull out and see, now this is where we are, and back into the action again.
Yeah, I agree, because those like short and sweet and to the point sentences add to the immediacy and they add to the intensity, because I mean, it's kind of like what you were just saying, Erica. It's just like boom, boom, boom. It's almost like a heartbeat with every period being so close to each other versus like a really long flowery sentence where you're like, okay, like what's going on? But if it's like a 3 to 4 word sentence, and then even if they're all in like their own paragraphs, you know what I'm saying? And it's just like boom, boom
Right.
to the next.
But oddly, a lot of people seem to take that to an extreme and do even their descriptive prose in lots of short sentences. And clearly they've read somewhere or been told by someone short sentences equals good. Like, not that they are good, but in the right context.
Yes.
Having the slightly flowery language is nice. You've just got to be aware of how to use it, right tool for the right job and all that.
I'm someone that I tend to prefer flowery language. It doesn't bother me if it's not there, but when it's fight time, that needs to go away.
Yeah, it's time to fight.
It is time to fight.
Yes.
I want to see some blood.
Get that guy.
Yeah.
I know, Erica.
I'm a man who loves Shakespeare, but
that makes sense.
I say I'm a man who loves Shakespeare, but once it's on, you've used your flowery prose to set the scene. The scene's set. Now it's him. That's just me.
I'm with you. Well, Erica or JP, do either of you have any other pet peeves or questions or anything else you want to hash out in this? We haven't pulled out the cleavers yet, so at least we are still in a peaceful conversation.
If we get into my pet peeves, we'll be here all night.
Well, I did have one last question. How do you transition out of your fight scenes back into just the normal action that happens in the book? Like, how do you give that breathing room? Because sometimes as a reader, if I'm reading it'll just snap back into, okay, well, now everyone's walking down the road again. And it's jarring.
I think that. Sorry for the sound there. That was a pen being dropped. Oddly enough, I'm sure it was jarring. So it was well timed, in fact. I think once your battle is done, it's not necessarily what the people are doing next, but it should be what they're thinking next. So even if you're having to go straight from, right, that's been won or lost, we have to be moving on to this place or that place. What the characters are feeling as a result of what's happened is, I think, a way of softening that transition so that in their minds, they're still just coming out of the battle. The scene itself might be them walking away. So I had, to quote my own work, to go into one of my books, we had a huge devastating battle, and the next chapter was about 4 or 5 days later at a peace negotiation. But we spent most of that scene in the head of the protagonist reliving the nightmare of the battle that had happened several days earlier. So that was my way of trying to cheat the notion of we've had to snap from one location to another physically. But in terms of the character's emotional state, and its character's emotions is what we're following in a story, it's a slower transition because she's still having to deal with the fact of what's just happened, if that makes sense.
And as a reader, I like that when there is that little bit of a time gap afterwards. That way you can see how the character has processed really everything that's happened to them or they've done to someone else, and really get to that kind of emotional weight from the battle.
There's that thing of PTSD is not a new thing by any means, and it has to take time for things to sink in. And it's, again, my humble opinion, it's an especially good thing to have to add realism, because of course we all know when adrenaline hits and there is fight or flight going on, our brave heroes, well, they have to be fighting people because that's the book, but they still have to be dealing with that emotional backlash somehow. So the traditional method is to say, well, they're putting it off, they're putting it to the back of their minds. And I think too many people have their heroes push the fear to the back of their minds and then it never comes back again because they've got more heroing to do. So it's a case of, right, I've done my heroing, I've done my push the fear to the back of my mind. Now it's going to punch me in the face because the danger's not there anymore and my psyche's able to take the time to react.
Right, just let it all flow back out.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Well, you know.
This was so
okay, this jolly discussion has had some rather unpleasant. Yes, life is terrible, isn't it? And humanity is awful and doomed and
Yep.
Yeah.
well, excellent.
That's how I feel.
There are consequences to punching someone, and you have to deal with it afterwards.
There are. I never realized.
Yes.
What are consequences?
There's consequences to being hit as well. They're not nice.
No.
Well, that was super interesting. I enjoyed that very much, especially from the beginning, learning that you studied martial arts, because that was new information from the beginning.
It's not a subject anyone should get me started on, or I'll be here for days talking about the cordial arts predating the Meiji Restoration of 1868 being not necessarily any superior to the Gendai arts that follow afterwards because they've had more experimentation. But that's a story for another day.
That's so cool, though.
We can have next time.
It adds so much more just weight, I guess, and depth to what all you can really do with your battle scenes because you have that knowledge. Yeah. And that's phenomenal.
Yes.
Got to make use of it somehow.
Yeah. I know all about
it's that. It's that, or all I've come out of it with is a dodgy knee and an aching shoulder. So let's hope that the years of knowledge have had some kind of benefit.
I think that they pay off, or they will.
Yeah.
Well, thank all of you people at home as well for watching. I will definitely make
Thank
sure
you.
obviously have Erica's channel linked in the description box, JP's books linked down in that description box, so go follow and purchase appropriately. I will also have a link to the shelf spaced in Discord server where, at least as of this recording, we are currently reading one of JP's books, so we'll have that discussion still up there after this video comes out if you want to pop on and share some thoughts. So in the meantime, I think that's going to wrap this all up. And I'm so appreciative to the two of you for joining me on this conversation. I had a great time. And I will see all of you other beautiful people in the next one. So have a good one, and I will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.